The world had not fallen in one single day. It happened slowly, piece by piece, so quietly that many people did not even notice until it was already too late. At first, the changes looked like distant problems. A faraway city covered in smoke from burning forests. A coastline flooded after a violent storm. Food prices that climbed a little every year. People thought these were temporary troubles. They told themselves life would go back to normal. But it never did. Each year the troubles grew heavier. The skies grew thicker with dust and heat. Summers stretched longer than anyone remembered, while winters came late, weak, and strange. Farmers could no longer trust the soil. Crops that had fed families for generations shriveled under the sun or drowned under unexpected rains. Water that once flowed clear from rivers now carried poison. Fish disappeared. Children grew sick more often. Still, people kept hoping. They had seen wars and disasters before, and somehow humanity had always survived. But this time felt different. This time the damage was everywhere and no place was safe. As the crisis spread, nations finally agreed to form a single council. It was the last great attempt to bring the world together. Leaders and experts from every corner of the earth sat in its circle. Their mission was simple in words but impossible in practice: save humanity before it was too late. The council's most powerful tool was known only as the button. It was not a weapon, though many feared it at first. It was a system, a creation of thousands of engineers built inside a vast underground hall. The button, once pressed, would unleash a chain of actions designed to give humans a second chance. Giant filters would clean the air. Water systems would restore rivers and lakes. Artificial fields could grow food quickly even in ruined soil. Energy would be released in controlled bursts to stabilize collapsing power grids. It was not perfect, but it was hope. And yet, even with hope right in front of them, the council could not act. Each meeting stretched into endless hours of arguments. Some leaders wanted to wait, fearing the button could fail and make things worse. Others demanded testing. More testing, always more testing. Some whispered that pressing it would cost too much, that it would give more power to certain nations than others. The council became a place of speeches, not decisions. Meanwhile, life outside those walls was breaking apart. Families who once dreamed of the future began to dream only of survival. Parents lined up for food that was never enough. Children carried empty water jars across cracked fields. Entire towns packed their belongings and left in search of safer land, though there was no safe place anymore. People looked to the council with desperate eyes, waiting for action. They said, surely the leaders know what to do. Surely someone will save us. But the council only spoke of patience, of careful steps. They promised the day would come soon. Soon, but not yet. Years passed like this. Cities that had been full of life fell silent. Skyscrapers stood empty, windows broken, streets growing weeds. The sound of traffic was replaced by the wind whistling through abandoned bridges. In villages, elders told stories of the days when rivers were blue and markets full of food, and children listened as if they were fairy tales. The council still met in their shining chamber, surrounded by screens and glowing maps, talking about humanity as if it were still whole. They spoke of the people while forgetting that fewer and fewer people were left. Scientists who worked closest to the crisis sent desperate reports. Numbers of deaths, numbers of migrations, numbers of births that were too few to keep balance. They pleaded, begged, saying time was almost gone. But the council delayed again, waiting for the perfect moment. It was not that the leaders were evil. They were human too, filled with fear of mistakes, fear of blame, fear of being remembered as the ones who pressed too early. They wanted certainty. They wanted guarantees. And so they waited, blind to the fact that certainty would never come. While they argued, the world outside kept changing. Lakes turned into deserts. Forests became ash. Birds fell silent in places where they had once filled the air with song. Entire generations grew up without ever seeing animals their grandparents had known well. Lions, elephants, whales, bees all faded away. And with them, humanity's spirit faded too. The council called for patience once more, promising that pressing the button would make sense in the right moment. But the right moment never arrived. People stopped waiting. Many turned bitter. Some tried to build their own small solutions, digging wells, growing food in secret gardens, sharing whatever little they had. Others gave up and walked into the ruins of the world, never to return. Still, inside the council's chamber, lights glowed, documents stacked higher, and meetings stretched longer. The leaders reminded each other that humanity had always found a way in the past. They believed there was still more time. But time was the very thing slipping through their fingers. The truth was simple. The people outside were losing hope, not because they did not believe in the button, but because they no longer believed in the council. And as days turned into years, humanity shrank in silence, not with a loud explosion, not with sudden chaos, but with a quiet, steady vanishing, one family, one village, one city at a time. In the end, the story of those waiting years was not about disaster alone. It was about hesitation. It was about people who had the chance to act, but chose to argue, hoping for certainty in a world that no longer allowed it. And so, while the council delayed, the rest of humanity faded, step by step into the shadows of history. The decline did not look like a great fall from a tall cliff. It was more like sinking into deep water, slowly, quietly, without realizing how far down the body had gone until the surface was already out of reach. Humanity's disappearance was not marked by one great moment, but by a million small ones. Doors locked for the last time, schools closing without ceremony, voices that stopped echoing in once busy streets. At first, people still believed the council would act. They listened to the speeches, the promises, the reassurances that the world's brightest minds were working on solutions. But slowly, faith turned into doubt. Families would gather around small radios or flickering screens, hoping for news that something had changed. Instead, they heard the same words again and again: patience, caution, preparation. Outside the walls of the council chamber, patience had become a luxury no one could afford. Food lines grew longer, but the food at the end of those lines grew shorter. Mothers divided one piece of bread into four, trying to stretch it for the entire family. Farmers, once proud of their harvests, looked out at empty fields that gave nothing back. Even when rain did fall, it came at the wrong times, drowning seeds before they had a chance to grow. Cities shrank. At first, only a few buildings were abandoned, left behind by families searching for better places. Then whole blocks emptied. Windows cracked, doors swung open in the wind, weeds pushed through the concrete. At night, the silence was the most haunting thing of all. Streets where cars had once crowded now lay still, the only sound the whistle of air through empty alleys. The silence spread like a shadow, city after city. The council kept receiving reports. Scientists sent data about falling birth rates, collapsing ecosystems, spreading diseases. The numbers grew darker with every year, yet the council table was always filled with debates about process and timing. Each meeting ended with more hesitation. Some argued that pressing the button might damage systems not yet ready. Others said humanity could recover without it, if only people endured a little longer. No one wanted to be the one responsible for making the wrong choice. Meanwhile, those numbers were not just numbers. They were people. A child who went to bed hungry and never woke up. An elder left behind when her village walked away in search of water. Entire families who vanished without a word, leaving only faded photographs pinned to walls. But inside the council's chamber, those lives were reduced to lines on graphs, percentages and charts glowing on digital screens. Communication between cities grew weaker. Power grids failed and were never fixed. Once, a single voice could travel across the world through phones and satellites, but now voices fell silent at the edges of dying networks. Families who had been separated by migration no longer knew if their loved ones were alive or gone. People began writing letters again, though few were ever delivered. In some places, communities tried to build their own survival systems. They dug wells, they shared what food they had, they repaired broken machines with scraps. For a time, small groups managed to keep hope alive. But without the larger systems, the medicine, the transportation, the energy, they could not hold on forever. Slowly, they too faded. There was no sudden collapse. That was the cruelest part. Humanity did not disappear in a roar, but in a whisper. One village left behind, one town empty, one city reduced to ashes and dust. By the time the council realized how much had been lost, the world outside their chamber had already gone quiet. The decline touched everything that made life human. Schools closed because there were not enough children. Festivals stopped because there was no food to celebrate with. Songs grew softer because there were fewer voices to sing them. In many places, people no longer spoke of the future at all. They spoke only of today. How to find water, how to find food, how to survive the night. Even nature seemed to mirror the silence. Birds that once filled the skies vanished. Forests grew thin. Rivers dried into cracked ground. Without people to care for them, buildings collapsed, roads crumbled, machines rusted. The great inventions of humanity, the towers, the highways, the aircraft, turned into skeletons, standing useless under the changing sky. The council still met. They still turned on their lights, gathered around their table, and told each other there was time. They believed humanity's heart was still beating strong somewhere beyond the walls. They thought villages were thriving, cities were holding, people were waiting for their command. They did not understand that outside the world had already fallen silent, and so the silent decline stretched on. It was not a war, not a disaster with flames and explosions. It was emptiness. It was the slow vanishing of footsteps, laughter, voices. It was the absence of children playing, the absence of markets buzzing, the absence of music drifting through open windows. What disappeared first was not the body of humanity, but its soul. In the end, the waiting had cost too much. By the time the council realized what was happening, humanity had almost slipped away completely, leaving behind only empty streets, broken homes, and the echo of what life used to be. The great hall of the council was almost empty now. Once it had been filled with hundreds of representatives, translators, assistants, and advisors. The air had buzzed with conversation, the tapping of shoes, the flashing of cameras. But on this day, only a small group remained. Their voices echoed in the vast chamber as if the walls themselves were mocking them. The button stood in the center of the hall. It was not a small red switch as Story sometimes made it sound. It was a colossal system, built like a heart made of steel and wires pulsing with quiet energy. Around it were countless screens, levers, and blinking lights. For years it had waited, silent, ready to unleash the changes that humanity had once prayed for. The council members stared at it with tired eyes. Their hair had grown gray during the years of waiting. Their faces carried lines from endless debates and sleepless nights. They had told themselves again and again that they were being careful, that they were protecting humanity from mistakes. But now deep inside, each of them knew the truth. They had waited too long. Still, something in them clung to the idea that this act could matter, that pressing the button might still turn the tide, that if there were survivors scattered somewhere in the silent world, this would be the signal that help had finally arrived. The chamber grew quiet as one of the members stood. His voice cracked, but his words carried across the empty room. "This is the hour. We cannot delay any longer. The world is broken. Our people are gone, but if even one life remains, let this be for them." The others nodded slowly. No one argued now. The debates were over. There was nothing left to say. Together, they approached the button. The room trembled as machines stirred to life. Hidden doors opened, revealing great engines buried deep beneath the earth. The lights above flickered as power surged through systems that had been asleep for too long. Dust fell from the ceiling, as if the building itself had been waiting for this moment. A final key was turned, and a sound filled the chamber, a deep, heavy hum, like the heartbeat of a giant. The button glowed, brighter and brighter until it seemed to burn in the center of the room. The council pressed it. For a moment, there was silence. Then across the world, systems began to awaken. Towers released bursts of clean air into the sky. Vast underground pumps pushed fresh water into dry rivers. Machines in ruined fields spread seeds into the soil, along with nutrients to help them grow. Satellites, long silent, lit up again, sending signals across the empty earth. It was as if humanity's greatest dream had finally come true. The button had worked. The world itself seemed to shiver as life-supporting systems came alive. The machines built to heal the planet had finally begun their task, but there was no cheering. No families hugging, no children laughing. Outside the council chamber, there were no crowds to celebrate. Streets remained empty. Houses stood silent. Cities stretched for miles without a single soul. The systems hummed and whirred, but there was no one to see them. The council looked at each other, but not with joy. Their eyes carried the weight of failure. They had pressed the button, yes, but they had pressed it too late. One of them whispered what all were thinking. "Where are the people?" They stepped outside the chamber for the first time in weeks. Dust swirled through the air. The grand plaza, once filled with life, was deserted. Flags that had once flown proudly were torn and faded. Statues of leaders stood untouched, but birds no longer rested on them because even the birds had gone. The council walked through empty streets. Their footsteps echoed loudly, as if the ground had forgotten what it felt like to carry human weight. They passed shops with broken windows, schools with doors swinging in the wind, playgrounds with rusting swings that moved only when the air pushed them. Everywhere they looked, there were signs of lives once lived. Half-finished meals, books left open on tables, toys scattered across dusty floors. But the people who had owned them were gone. It was then the truth struck them with full force. They had not just been late, they had been too late. Humanity had already vanished before the button was ever pressed. The machines worked tirelessly. Clouds of fresh rain began to form. Fields slowly turned green. Power grids lit up again, buzzing with energy. But all of it was meaningless without humans to use it, to nurture it, to pass it down to the next generation. The council returned to their chamber, their shoulders heavy. They had finally acted, but their action had no audience. They had saved a world that no longer had people to claim it. Some of them wept quietly. Others stared blankly at the glowing lights of the button, wondering if history would remember them as saviors or as fools. Perhaps there would be no history at all, no memory, no record of this moment except for the machines that would continue their work until they too broke down and turned to dust. Far away, in places where humans once thrived, animals began to creep out of hiding. Deer walked down empty highways. Wolves roamed through abandoned factories. Birds circled above crumbling stadiums. Nature, cautious but curious, started to reclaim the spaces humans had left behind. The button had been pressed, yes, but not for people. It had been pressed for a silence that stretched across the world. The council members sat in their chamber until night fell. The lights of the machines glowed around them like stars in the dark. They knew in their hearts that their final act was not a triumph but a tragedy. They had waited for the right moment, but the right moment had passed years ago. And now, though the machines hummed and the world stirred, humanity was gone. The machines did not know loneliness. They did not know silence. To them, the world was still alive because their sensors told them so. Lights blinked, gears turned, systems carried out their work exactly as they had been designed. They were built to serve people, but no people remained to direct them. Across the empty earth, the echoes of humanity lived on through these machines. Towers released fresh air into skies that no one breathed. Great pumps pulled clean water into rivers. But no children splashed in those waters, no farmers came to carry buckets to their fields. Vast fields of crops were sown by automated arms, their green shoots rising proudly from the soil, but there was no one to harvest them when the time came. Cities lit up again. Streetlights glowed in perfect order, lamps blinking on at dusk as if waiting for workers to return home. Trains powered themselves, sliding along tracks with doors opening and closing at empty stations. Automated voices announced arrivals, though no one stepped inside. Entire transportation systems ran as if millions of travelers were still rushing to catch them. The emptiness made the machines seem almost haunted. In some towns, loudspeakers still played public announcements, reminding citizens of safety rules, asking them to remain calm, promising that help was on the way. The words echoed down streets where only the wind listened. Nature, on the other hand, noticed the difference. Without humans cutting forests or chasing animals away, the earth began to breathe again. Plants pushed through cracks in the pavement. Trees rose high through the roofs of abandoned houses. Vines wrapped themselves around old monuments and climbed broken towers. In the silence, animals returned. Deer grazed in supermarket parking lots. Birds built nests inside the hollow shells of offices. Foxes roamed through playgrounds where children once played. The strange part was how quickly the earth seemed to heal. The air grew clearer. The rivers, now cleansed by machines and untouched by factories, began to sparkle again. Fields turned green without farmers, as if the soil had been waiting for a chance to rest and grow wild. It was a world repairing itself, but repairing for no one. The council members, what few of them still remained alive, wandered through this emptiness. They could see the machines working, doing everything they had hoped for years ago, but instead of joy, they felt the weight of sorrow pressing harder on their hearts. They had dreamed of saving people, not only saving land. What was the use of rain without thirsty mouths to drink it? What was the use of food without hungry stomachs to fill? One day, one of them walked into a great stadium. The machines had turned the lights on automatically, flooding the empty seats with brightness. The giant screens flashed messages welcoming fans, yet not a single voice rose in cheer. Not a single footstep echoed on the concrete. He stood there, surrounded by shadows of what once was, and the silence was louder than any roar of a crowd. In another place, a train sped through mountains, its windows shining in the night. Inside, the seats were perfectly clean, polished by machines that wiped them each day. The speakers reminded invisible passengers to keep belongings safe. The doors opened at a station where not a single person stood. After a moment, the doors closed and the train continued its endless journey, carrying no one. Everywhere, reminders of humanity lingered. Half-written letters on desks, shoes left by the doorway, musical instruments resting quietly in corners, paintings hanging on walls inside houses whose owners had never returned. The world was a museum now, filled with artifacts of a species that had vanished before its creations could save it. The most haunting part was how normal it all seemed. Lights glowed at night. Machines carried out their tasks. Crops grew in neat rows. Rivers ran full. But there was no laughter, no tears, no voices. The planet had everything except people. And yet, in that emptiness, life of another kind began to take root. Animals walked freely down highways, unafraid of cars that no longer moved. Forests swallowed suburbs, turning human streets into trails for wild creatures. Wolves howled where once music played. Whales swam freely in oceans now quieter without ships. Slowly, the Earth began to write a new story, one that did not include humans. The Council knew their work had been meaningless, but still the machines carried on. Perhaps that was the cruelest truth, that the world did not stop because humanity was gone. Systems ran without their makers. Nature thrived without its rulers. The Earth had moved on, leaving the Council behind like ghosts who had lingered too long. Sometimes when the Council walked through abandoned places, they would imagine hearing voices. A child calling out, a crowd laughing, the sound of music drifting through an open window. But when they turned their heads, there was only wind moving through empty rooms. They realized that in trying to save humanity with machines, they had forgotten to save humanity itself. They had waited so long for the perfect decision that the people who needed saving had slipped away in silence. And now, the echoes of emptiness surrounded them everywhere. Machines built to serve humans kept running without purpose. Nature thrived without human control. The world was alive, but humanity's place in it was gone. In the end, the great tragedy was not only that people had vanished, but that they had vanished so quietly. No grand farewell, no final moment of unity. Just an empty Earth filled with systems still waiting to be used. The echoes of humanity were everywhere. Lights in cities, food in fields, voices in machines. But they were only echoes. The living, breathing heart of the world had already gone. The world was alive, but it no longer carried the sound of human footsteps. The machines continued their endless tasks, and nature spread its roots and wings without interruption. Yet in the ruins of houses, in the dust of libraries, in the silent chambers of the Council, the memory of humanity still lingered. It lingered not in voices or laughter, but in objects and records, in things built to be remembered, even when no one remained to do the remembering. The Council's decision, their final act of pressing the button, was written carefully in official reports. They had recorded the debates, the reasons, the signatures on documents. Every file was stored in archives, locked away in systems that were programmed to keep history safe. But safe for who? There was no one left to read them. The machines that guarded those memories worked faithfully, as if waiting for students to come and study, as if expecting future generations to walk in and learn. But no children would arrive. No teacher would ever open those files. They would remain untouched until the machines themselves wore down and turned to dust. The tragedy was not only that humans had vanished, but that their story was left without readers. All the art, the music, the poems, the discoveries, the great works of imagination, everything that gave meaning to life were still there, stored in books and drives and paintings hanging quietly on walls. But a story without someone to tell it, or someone to listen, is only silence. The Council members sat in their hall, smaller in number each day, staring at the machines they had activated. They had done their duty, they told themselves. They had finally pressed the button. But duty without people to serve felt like an empty shell. Their faces were lined with regret, their voices heavy with words that no longer mattered. In their hearts they knew they had not saved humanity. They had only saved the memory of what could have been. And memory without witnesses fades quickly. The houses that stood empty began to collapse as time passed. Roofs caved in, walls crumbled, roads split apart as roots pushed through them. Little by little, the world erased the signs of its former rulers, but here and there traces remained. A book lying open on a table, its pages yellowing. A recording still playing on a loop in a forgotten shop. A child's toy resting in the corner of a dusty room. These were not history books. They were fragments, pieces of lives cut short, scattered across the world. Anyone who might have come after would not know the story of the council or the button. They would only find these fragments and wonder about the people who once existed. Nature did not wonder. It only grew. Forests stretched over highways. Rivers cut new paths through abandoned cities. Animals built their homes where humans once built theirs. Slowly, the planet became something new, a place filled with life, but without the species that once believed it controlled everything. In the far future, perhaps some other form of life would rise. Perhaps creatures would evolve to question, to imagine, to build. If they ever found the ruins, would they understand what had happened? Would they know there was once a species that built machines powerful enough to save a world, but waited too long to use them? Or would humanity's story simply dissolve into the soil, lost forever, remembered by no one? The council in their last days often spoke of legacy. They wanted to believe their actions would be remembered, that someone someday might discover their records and understand. But as their numbers grew smaller, they began to accept the truth. Legacy only exists if someone is left to inherit it, and there was no one left. Their final act became a whisper carried by machines, signals sent into space, beams of information launched into the dark sky. Perhaps, they thought, some distant intelligence would one day hear those signals. Perhaps the story of humanity would travel across the stars, even if it could not survive on Earth. That was the last comfort they allowed themselves. But here on the ground, the story ended quietly. Not with a bang, not with one final cry, but with silence. Humanity had vanished, and the world carried on without it. The Earth did not mourn. The rivers kept flowing. The forests kept growing. The animals filled the empty spaces. The systems built by human hands kept running until their energy ran out. And in that strange, empty harmony, the council's final act was reduced to nothing more than an echo. It was an echo of fear, hesitation, delay. An echo of leaders who wanted to act but waited for certainty, even as time slipped away. An echo of ordinary people who suffered while promises were made but not kept. An echo of a species that had the power to save itself, but could not find the courage to act when it mattered. In the end, humanity's story became what all stories eventually become when no one tells them. Silence. The books would crumble, the recordings would fade, the machines would rust. And the memory of people, their dreams, their mistakes, their songs, their laughter would vanish with them. The button had been pressed. The systems had worked. The Earth had healed. But without humans, the act was not a victory. It was a reminder carved into emptiness that waiting too long can cost everything, and so the world moved on. The council's chamber fell quiet. The cities grew into forests. The oceans sang their eternal song. The sky carried signals into the darkness of space, hoping someone, somewhere might listen. But here on Earth no ears remained. Only echoes, only silence.